Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the dusty, blood-soaked annals of ancient Greek mythology. Imagine yourself, if you will, curled up on a plush velvet chaise lounge in a dimly lit, opulent chamber. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax candles and forgotten papyrus, and just beyond the ornate floor-to-ceiling windows, you can hear the distant rhythmic crash of waves against a rocky shore. It's the kind of night where shadows play tricks on your peripheral vision, and every creak of the floorboards sounds like a phantom whisper. We're going to untangle a family tree so gnarly, so utterly cursed, that honestly you probably won't survive this narrative without needing a good long nap, or perhaps a strong cup of something entirely unmythological. Seriously, these folks make your most dysfunctional holiday dinner look like a picnic at Disney. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening in, let me know where you are in the comments and what time it is. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or rather, the beginning of this sprawling, multi-generational nightmare, kicks off with a fellow named Tantalus. Now, Tantalus wasn't just any old mortal. He was the son of Zeus, which, as you might guess, came with some serious perks. Think VIP access to Mount Olympus divine dinner parties, endless ambrosia, and nectar, the whole 9 yards. He was practically living the dream, the ancient Greek equivalent of having a permanent backstage pass to the hottest concerts in the cosmos. But Tantalus, bless his misguided heart, wasn't content with just rubbing elbows with the gods. He had a severe case of hubris, that classic Greek flaw of excessive pride that almost always precedes a dramatic downfall. It's like bringing your own questionable casserole to a Michelin-starred potluck. You're just asking for trouble. One day, Tantalus decided he wanted to test the omniscience of the gods, which, frankly, is a terrible idea. It's like trying to sneak a peek at the answers on a pop quiz when your teacher literally invented the subject. He cooked up a plan so heinous, so utterly beyond the pale that it still makes you squirm just thinking about it. He murdered his own son Pelops, chopped him into pieces, and served him up in a stew to the Olympian gods at a banquet. Yes, you heard that right. A human casserole. The nerve of the man. He wanted to see if the gods in their divine wisdom would actually notice that something was amiss with the menu. It was the ultimate gotcha moment in his twisted mind. Most of the gods, being well gods, immediately recognized the horror before them. They recoiled, disgusted, their divine stomachs churning. However, Demeter, still distraught from the abduction of her daughter Persephone, was a bit distracted. In her grief, she unknowingly ate a piece of Pelops's shoulder. A minor oversight in the grand scheme of things, but one that would become a rather quirky fringe tidbit later on. Pelops would forever after have an ivory shoulder, courtesy of the gods' magical reconstruction. Think of it as ancient Greek reconstructive surgery, but with way more divine intervention and significantly fewer insurance forms. When the gods realized the full extent of Tantalus's atrocity, they were understandably furious. This wasn't just rude. It was a profound insult, a violation of every sacred boundary between mortals and immortals. Zeus, his patience, worn thin by his son's antics, condemned Tantalus to an eternal torment in the underworld. And what a torment it was. You're probably familiar with the image. Tantalus stands in a pool of water that recedes every time he tries to drink, and beneath branches laden with fruit that move away every time he reaches for them. He is forever tantalized by what he desires but can never possess. It's the ultimate cosmic prank, a cruel irony for a man who tried to trick the very beings who controlled his fate. Historians still argue whether Tantalus's specific punishment was primarily about testing the gods' knowledge or about the profound violation of hospitality. But honestly, it feels like a 2-for-1 deal on divine retribution. This single horrific act, this original sin of the Tantalid line, sets the stage for a curse that will ripple through 4 generations, staining everything it touches with grief, betrayal, and unspeakable violence. It's a foundational myth for understanding the deep-seated notion of hereditary guilt in Greek tragedy, where the sins of the father are literally visited upon the sons and then some. You can practically hear the ominous background music starting to swell. Section 2. So, Tantalus is forever thirsty and hungry, living out his days in a personalized, divine-level torture chamber. But what about poor Pelops? The good news is the gods, being rather fond of their own dinner parties and generally disliking cannibalism, stitched him back together. All except for that one shoulder, of course, which, as you now know, was replaced with a gleaming piece of ivory. It's an interesting detail, isn't it? A permanent reminder of his father's monstrous act, a kind of ancient medical alert bracelet signaling, caution, this dude's dad tried to serve him for dinner. You can imagine the awkwardness at family reunions. Oh, Pelops still rocking that ivory shoulder, I see. Looks very natural. Now, despite this rather traumatic start, Pelops was resurrected, and he eventually found himself in Pisa, not the Italian one, mind you, but an ancient city in Elis, Greece, a common point of confusion for anyone not steeped in obscure Greek geography. Here, he set his sights on Hippodamia, the beautiful daughter of King Oenomaus. The problem, King Oenomaus had a bit of an Oedipal complex mixed with a passion for chariot racing. He loved his daughter, you see, so much, so that he devised a rather brutal father knows best marriage test. Any suitor who wished to marry Hippodamia had to defeat him in a chariot race. The catch, if you lost, Oenomaus would spear you to death and nail your head to his palace wall. Charming. He had already collected 13 heads, which, let's be honest, is less of a warning and more of a deeply unsettling interior design choice. Imagine the smell. Pelops, however, was not easily deterred. He understood the stakes were high, essentially a high-speed game of marry the princess or become a trophy. Recognizing he couldn't win on pure speed alone against a king who was apparently the Lewis Hamilton of ancient Greece, Pelops resorted to trickery, a recurring theme in this family, as you might have noticed. He went to Myrtilus Oenomaus's charioteer and offered him half the kingdom and the first night with Hippodamia if he helped him win. Myrtilus, seduced by the promise of power, and, well, the other promise agreed. He secretly replaced the bronze linchpins on Oenomaus's chariot with wax ones. It's a classic move, isn't it? The ancient Greek equivalent of sabotaging your rival's car in a demolition derby. The race began a whirlwind of dust, thundering hooves, and the roar of the crowd. As Oenomaus's chariot gained on Pelops, the wax linchpins melted under the heat and friction, causing the wheels to fly off. The king was dragged to his death, entangled in the reins, a rather fitting end for a man who used chariots to dispatch his rivals. Pelops naturally won the race and, therefore, the hand of Hippodamia. You'd think this would be a happy ending, right? Boy gets girl, kingdom gained, curse lifted. Not so fast. Remember that curse from Tantalus? It's more tenacious than a toddler with a permanent marker. Pelops, having secured his victory, then committed his own act of betrayal. He reneged on his promise to Myrtilus. As they were crossing the Isthmus of Corinth, a rather significant geographical landmark historically connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece, Pelops pushed Myrtilus off a cliff into the sea. Why, some say he didn't want to share the kingdom, others that he was disgusted by Myrtilus's demand for Hippodamia, or perhaps he just preferred to keep a secret, a very dark secret buried. As Myrtilus fell to his watery grave, he uttered a dying curse upon Pelops and his descendants. May your house be forever plagued by strife and murder, or words to that effect. Historians still argue over the precise wording and efficacy of Myrtilus's curse, but its impact is undeniable. This act, this second layer of betrayal and murder, compounded the original sin of Tantalus, deepening the shadow that clung to the family. Pelops may have founded a dynasty, becoming the powerful ruler of the Peloponnese, which incidentally is named after him, literally meaning Pelops's island. But he did so on a foundation of deceit and bloodshed. You see, the Greeks had this rather firm belief that actions had consequences, especially when those actions involved breaking oaths or committing sacrilege. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a cosmic ledger balancing out. And Pelops, by breaking his promise to Myrtilus and then murdering him, essentially scribbled another giant, inky blotch onto the family's already cursed parchment. This wasn't just a minor squabble. This was the equivalent of adding another active volcano to an already seismically unstable region. The stage is now perfectly set for the next generation to inherit this toxic family legacy. So, Pelops, with his ivory shoulder and newly acquired kingdom, settles down with Hippodamia. You'd think, wouldn't you, that with a king named after his dominion and a queen who finally got to avoid becoming a head on a stick, things might finally calm down a bit for this family. Perhaps a nice quiet reign, some sensible tax reforms, maybe a festival dedicated to not trying to trick gods or sabotage chariots. But no, the curse, that sticky, insidious family heirloom, wasn't done yet. Pelops and Hippodamia had several children, but two of them, Atreus and Thyestes, would become the next poster children for this generational grief. These two brothers from the very beginning were locked in a rivalry that made your average sibling squabble look like a friendly game of rock, paper, scissors. It wasn't about who got the bigger slice of cake or who got to ride shotgun. It was about power, prestige, and who would ultimately rule Mycenae, a rather important city. That fun fact later became one of the most significant centers of the Mycenaean civilization, a powerhouse during the late Bronze Age. Think of it as the Silicon Valley of ancient Greece, but with more gold masks and fewer disruptors. The first major flashpoint in their feud involved a rather bizarre symbol of kingship, a golden fleeced ram. Now in ancient Greece, signs from the gods were a big deal. They weren't just whispers in the wind. They were often tangible, divine endorsements. This ram appeared in Atreus's flock, and he, being the elder brother and rather keen on consolidating his claim to the throne, declared it a divine sign that he, and he alone, should rule. It's like finding a winning lottery ticket in your sock drawer and proclaiming yourself monarch. Thyestes, however, was not about to let his brother have an easy win. He was cunning, ambitious, and, frankly, a bit of a scoundrel. He had been having an affair with Atreus's wife, Aerope. Yes, you heard that right. Not just a simple rivalry, but a messy, scandalous affair that would make any modern tabloid journalist salivate. Thyestes, using his illicit relationship with Aerope, managed to convince her to steal the golden fleeced ram from Atreus and give it to him. So, imagine the scene. Atreus proudly presents his divinely ordained ram, only for Thyestes to smugly reveal his own golden fleeced ram. It's the ancient Greek equivalent of two siblings showing up to a party in the exact same outfit. But one of them clearly stole it from the other's closet. The air crackles with tension. This act of betrayal, both the theft of the ram and the infidelity with Aerope, pushed Atreus over the edge. He was consumed by a cold, calculating rage, a rage that would make Tantalus's initial fit of hubris look like a mild annoyance. Atreus banished Thyestes from Mycenae, a standard punishment one might think for such egregious acts. But for Atreus, simple banishment wasn't enough. The curse demanded more. The thirst for vengeance, remember, was a dominant genetic trait in this family line. This deep-seated rivalry, fueled by divine omens, stolen livestock, and marital betrayal, established a pattern of violence and deceit that would define the entire house. Historians still argue about the precise mythological significance of the golden fleeced ram. Was it purely a symbol of sovereignty? Or did it carry deeper chthonic or fertility connotations? Regardless, its role as a catalyst in this brotherly feud is undeniable. You can almost feel the chill in the air, the sense of dread that this isn't just a squabble over a kingdom, but a prelude to something far more sinister. The stage is perfectly set for Atreus to unleash a vengeance so horrific it would make Tantalus's dinner party seem almost quaint by comparison. Almost. So Thyestes is banished, his reputation tarnished, his affair exposed, and his golden ram-based claim to the throne utterly debunked. You might think for a moment that Atreus, having successfully exiled his conniving brother, would now enjoy a peaceful reign in Mycenae. Perhaps some delightful chariot festivals, a bit of olive oil production, maybe even a new set of laws concerning the ethical handling of mythological livestock. But remember, that curse, that persistent shadow stretching down through the generations, it wasn't about to let a little banishment put a damper on its plans for maximum misery. Atreus's rage wasn't a fleeting temper tantrum. It was a slow-burning inferno, fueled by the memory of betrayal and the weight of his family's cursed legacy. He began to concoct a plan, a horrifying scheme that would not only reassert his dominance, but also inflict a wound so deep, so utterly unforgivable, that it would echo for centuries. Atreus, with a chilling calmness that probably made his servants double-check their own loyalty, sent a message to Thyestes. It was an invitation, seemingly an olive branch, extended across the chasm of their bitter rivalry. Come home. The message probably read, "Let us reconcile. Let bygones be bygones." It was the ancient Greek equivalent of an email from your estranged relative saying, "Let's catch up over dinner." Only the dinner involves a very specific kind of protein. Thyestes, perhaps desperate for a return to power, or perhaps blinded by a flicker of hope for reconciliation, fell for it. He returned to Mycenae, walking straight into Atreus's meticulously prepared trap. You can almost hear the ominous cello music building in the background. Atreus prepared a grand banquet, ostensibly to celebrate their newfound peace. The tables groaned under the weight of delicious food. The wine flowed freely, and the atmosphere was on the surface, one of joyous reunion. But beneath the veneer of hospitality, Atreus had orchestrated a horror that would outdo even Tantalus's original sin. While Thyestes feasted, oblivious, Atreus had his 3 young sons, Aglaus, Calileon, and Orchomenus, secretly murdered, butchered, and then cooked into the very meal Thyestes was consuming. Yes, your ears do not deceive you. Another horrific family-on-family, cannibalistic dinner. It seems the Tantalid family had a very specific and deeply disturbing culinary tradition. It's almost like they were trying to one-up each other in the most messed-up family dinner competition. My dad cooked me. Oh yeah, my brother cooked my kids. Thyestes unknowingly consumed the flesh of his own children. Imagine the scene, the clinking of glasses, the forced laughter, the taste of something vaguely unsettling. Atreus watched him, probably with a cold, triumphant glint in his eye, savoring the moment of ultimate psychological torture. Only after Thyestes had finished eating did Atreus reveal the horrifying truth. He brought out the heads and hands of the slaughtered children, displaying them to his brother. The shock, the horror, the unimaginable grief that must have washed over Thyestes in that moment. It was a revelation designed to shatter his very soul, a revenge so absolute it left no room for escape or forgiveness. Thyestes, reeling from the horrific truth, cursed Atreus and his entire lineage once more. This curse wasn't just a dying whisper like Myrtilus's. It was a howl of pure, unadulterated agony and rage, echoing the profound violation of natural order. He then fled, Mycenae banished once more, but this time utterly broken, a shell of his former self, consumed by a grief so profound it would lead him to even more desperate acts. This act by Atreus solidified the curse on the house of Atreus, ensuring that the cycle of violence and retribution would continue unabated. This was not merely a crime. It was an act of impiety so profound that it guaranteed divine displeasure for generations. A mainstream historical fact here. While specific events like golden-fleeced rams and cannibalistic feasts are mythological, the concept of fratricidal conflict and dynastic struggles was a very real and persistent feature of early Greek history and city-state formation. Power often changed hands through violent means, betrayals, and ruthless suppression of rivals. So, while the details are fantastical, the underlying themes of ambition, power, and the lengths people would go to secure it are deeply rooted in human history. Historians still debate the extent to which these myths served as cautionary tales for rulers, or simply reflected the brutal realities of ancient political life. But one thing is clear: Atreus's feast was less a reconciliation and more a deeply disturbing appetizer for the next course of the family's unending tragedy. And oh, what a next course it would be! Thyestes, broken and utterly devastated, fled Mycenae once more, carrying with him the unspeakable horror of Atreus's feast. His heart wasn't just heavy with grief, it was consumed by a burning, singular desire for vengeance. The curse of Tantalus, amplified by Pelops's betrayal and solidified by Atreus's unspeakable act, now coursed through Thyestes' very veins, demanding an equally terrible retribution. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a walking vessel of the curse, a personification of the family's unending cycle of pain. You might imagine him wandering the ancient Greek landscape, a haunted figure perhaps muttering to himself, seeing the specters of his murdered children in every flickering shadow. He was no longer seeking a throne. He was seeking an instrument of divine, or perhaps simply infernal justice. During his exile, Thyestes sought guidance from an oracle, a common practice in ancient Greece. When you found yourself in a particularly sticky situation, especially one involving infanticide and cannibalism, the oracle delivered a chilling prophecy. Thyestes would have a son by his own daughter, Pelopia, and that son would be the one to avenge him by killing Atreus. Yes, you heard that right. Incest. Because when you're already neck-deep in a generational curse involving cannibalism and betrayal, why not add another layer of profound societal taboo to the mix? It seems the Furies, those terrifying deities of vengeance, were truly pulling out all the stops to ensure maximum discomfort for everyone involved. Driven by the prophecy and his desperate need for vengeance, Thyestes in disguise encountered his daughter Pelopia, who was serving as a priestess. Unbeknownst to both of them, he raped her. This horrifying act, a direct consequence of the oracle's twisted directive, led to the birth of Aegisthus. Pelopia, ashamed and horrified by the unknown assault, abandoned the infant Aegisthus in the wilderness. It's a classic mythological trope, isn't it? The unwanted child left to the elements, only to be found and raised by shepherds, or, in this case, by others, in a twist of fate that ensured the prophecy would be fulfilled. Aegisthus was eventually found and raised by shepherds, and later by Atreus himself, who believed him to be his own son, or perhaps the son of someone else entirely, but certainly not the product of his brother's incestuous union with his daughter. Oh, the dramatic irony! Atreus, the orchestrator of such meticulous cruelty, unknowingly nurtured the very instrument of his own downfall right under his nose. It's like a villain in a suspense movie adopting the orphan, who's secretly the hero's long-lost sibling, destined to defeat him. You can almost see the audience collectively groaning in anticipation. Aegisthus grew up in Atreus's household, privy to the court life, learning the ways of power, and all the while the seeds of his true identity and terrible destiny lay dormant. He harbored no immediate ill will towards Atreus, at least not consciously. He was, to all appearances, just another member of the royal household, a product of circumstance rather than conscious malice. But fate, or perhaps the persistent nagging of the curse, had other plans. When Aegisthus was older, Thyestes finally revealed the truth to him, his true parentage, and the horrific tale of Atreus's feast, painting Atreus as the ultimate villain, the perpetrator of unspeakable crimes against his family. Imagine that conversation, the sudden shattering of your entire understanding of your life, your family, your very identity. It's enough to make anyone reconsider their career choices. Aegisthus, now fully aware of the monstrous crimes committed against his father and his own incestuous origins, was consumed by a righteous, or perhaps simply inherited, fury. He felt the weight of his father's suffering, the echoes of the murdered children, and the profound injustice of it all. He became the living embodiment of Thyestes' desire for revenge, the sharpened edge of the curse's blade. He murdered Atreus, finally bringing the long-anticipated retribution to the man who had orchestrated such unimaginable cruelty. This act brought the cycle of direct generational vengeance within this specific branch to a temporary close, but not without setting the stage for the next tragic chapter, as the larger curse remained stubbornly active. A mainstream historical fact. The concept of divine oracular prophecy profoundly influenced decision-making in ancient Greece, from personal matters to major political and military campaigns. People genuinely believed that Oracles like the one at Delphi provided direct insights into the will of the gods, even if those insights often required rather liberal interpretation. Historians still debate the true influence of these religious institutions on political outcomes versus their use as legitimizing tools for predetermined decisions. Regardless, for Aegisthus, the oracle's words were a blueprint for his life's terrible purpose. And with Atreus dead, the throne of Mycenae was now ripe for the taking by none other than the man who embodied the curse's darkest fulfillment. With Atreus finally dispatched by the avenging hand of Aegisthus, you might think the air in Mycenae would clear, perhaps even smell a little less like betrayal and cooked human flesh. But no, the curse, like a particularly persistent mosquito, merely buzzed around for its next victim. Aegisthus, having fulfilled his grim destiny, now held the reins of power in Mycenae, but it was a power born of murder and incest. And that kind of foundation tends to be rather unstable. He was effectively a placeholder, a temporary vessel for the curse's dark energy, setting the stage for the next prominent figure in this tragic saga, Agamemnon. Agamemnon was Atreus's son, which, if you've been following along, means he inherited a family legacy that was less a golden inheritance and more a booby-trapped minefield. He was, by all accounts, a strong leader, a formidable warrior, and a man destined for greatness, or at least for a starring role in the greatest military epic of the ancient world. But before all that, he had to deal with the immediate aftermath of his father's murder. With Atreus dead and Thyestes in power, or at least Aegisthus, his son, pulling the strings, Agamemnon and his younger brother Menelaus found themselves in a rather precarious position. They were forced to flee Mycenae, finding refuge in Sparta under the protection of King Tyndareus. It's a classic underdog story, isn't it? The exiled princes, biding their time, gathering strength, plotting their return. While in Sparta, a rather significant romantic entanglement took place. Menelaus married Helen, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, and widely considered the most beautiful woman in the world. And not just pretty. She was the kind of beautiful that launched 1,000 ships, literally. Agamemnon, meanwhile, married Helen's sister, Clytemnestra. This detail is crucial, as Clytemnestra, already a strong-willed woman, would later play a pivotal role in the continuation of the curse's grim work. It's almost too neat, isn't it? The brothers marrying into a royal family that would soon be embroiled in their own epic drama, only to become intertwined with the Atreides curse. With the support of Tyndareus, and later his successor, and Helen's brother Castor and Pollux, who, fun fact, were also divinely born and incredibly skilled warriors, making them quite the formidable in-laws, Agamemnon eventually managed to reclaim his rightful place on the throne of Mycenae. He drove out Aegisthus and Thyestes, bringing an end to their brief, cursed reign. This was Agamemnon's moment of triumph, his ascent to power. He established himself as the most powerful king in all of Greece, the preeminent ruler among the Achaeans. He commanded immense wealth, vast armies, and the respect and sometimes fear of his fellow Greek leaders. Mycenae, under his rule, flourished, becoming a true center of power, just as archaeological evidence suggests. The historical Mycenae was a significant Bronze Age citadel. Agamemnon, despite his inherited family baggage, seemed to embody the ideal Greek hero king. He was brave, decisive, and capable of uniting disparate forces under his command. You might even think that the curse had finally run its course, that with a strong, legitimate king on the throne, the dark cloud would dissipate. But the curse of the Atreides wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow-acting poison, and its most potent effects were still brewing, waiting for the perfect catalyst. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Mycenaean civilization, roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE, was indeed characterized by powerful centralized kingdoms, impressive fortifications like the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae itself, and extensive trade networks. Leaders like Agamemnon, even if mythological, reflect the very real political and military structures of this era. Historians still argue about the precise relationship between the Homeric epics and the historical realities of the Mycenaean period. Was Homer describing a literal past, or was he weaving legends around historical echoes? Regardless, the idea of a dominant king like Agamemnon leading a confederation of Greek states resonates with what we know of the late Bronze Age. And it was this very power, this very prominence that would tragically position Agamemnon to become the next major casualty of his cursed bloodline. His rise to power was merely the calm before the cataclysm. So, Agamemnon is at the height of his power, ruling Mycenae with an iron, if somewhat cursed fist. His brother Menelaus is king of Sparta, married to the famously beautiful Helen. All seems relatively calm, perhaps even idyllic, for this notoriously troubled family. But you know by now that peace is merely a temporary interlude in the Atreides saga, a brief moment to catch your breath before the next tidal wave of misery crashes down. And crash it does, with an event so monumental it reshaped the ancient world, the abduction of Helen. Now, Helen, as we've established, was not just any pretty face. She was the face that would launch 1,000 ships, a living, breathing catalyst for war. And speaking of catalysts, enter Paris, a prince of Troy. Paris was, to put it mildly, a bit of a smooth talker, and perhaps a little too confident in his charm. He traveled to Sparta ostensibly on a diplomatic mission, but his true agenda was far more scandalous. He had been promised the most beautiful woman in the world by the goddess Aphrodite. As a reward for judging her the fairest in a divine beauty contest, a whole other dramatic story involving a golden apple and a very ill-advised decision. And that woman was, of course, Helen. During Menelaus's absence, conveniently, he was off in Crete, attending his grandfather's funeral, because, of course, He was Paris, with Aphrodite's divine assistance, convinced Helen to abandon her husband, her young daughter Hermione, and her kingdom, and sail away with him to Troy. Was it seduction? Was it abduction? Was it fate? Historians still argue whether Helen went willingly or was forcibly, taken a debate that touches upon agency and blame in ancient narratives. Regardless, the outcome was the same Helen. The Queen of Sparta was gone spirited away to a foreign land by a Trojan prince. It was, in polite terms, a massive international incident. In less polite terms, it was the ultimate act of disrespect, a slap across the collective face of the entire Greek world. When Menelaus returned to an empty palace and a vacant queen, he was understandably beyond furious. He had been cuckolded, his honor deeply insulted, and his royal household thrown into chaos. He immediately sought out his brother Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae, and the most powerful ruler in Greece. Agamemnon, despite his own family's history of internal strife, understood the gravity of the situation. An insult to Menelaus was an insult to all of Greece, and allowing Troy to get away with such a brazen act would undermine his own authority and the prestige of the entire Achaean alliance. Thus began the arduous process of assembling the largest military expedition ancient Greece had ever seen. Messengers were dispatched to every corner of the Greek world, reminding kings and chieftains of their oaths to Tyndareus, Helen's foster father, who had made all her suitors swear an oath to defend her husband's rights, whoever he might be. It was a call to arms, a monumental undertaking that required incredible logistical planning. Imagine trying to coordinate 1,000 ships and tens of thousands of warriors, all with their own agendas and egos, across a sea. It was basically the ancient world's most ambitious group project, except the stakes were global war and not just a failing grade. Agamemnon, as the most powerful king, naturally assumed the role of commander-in-chief of the united Greek forces. This was his moment to shine on the world stage, to lead his people to glory and reclaim his brother's honor. But as you know, for the Atreides, every triumph seems to come with a corresponding, often devastating price. This immense undertaking, this gathering of heroes like Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Nestor under Agamemnon's banner, would set in motion a chain of events that would further entangle the cursed bloodline in an inescapable web of tragedy. The Trojan War, while ostensibly about Helen, was also in a deeper sense the next brutal chapter in the unfolding narrative of the House of Atreus. The stage was set, the ships were gathered, and the winds of destiny, or perhaps just the whims of spiteful gods, were about to blow. A mainstream historical fact, while the Trojan War, as depicted in Homer's Iliad, is a mythological epic, archaeological evidence, particularly the excavations at Hisarlik, believed to be ancient Troy by Heinrich Schliemann, suggests that a significant fortified city existed in that region and experienced periods of destruction, possibly due to conflict during the late Bronze Age. This lends a kernel of historical plausibility to the idea of a major conflict in that area. A quirky tidbit: the Greeks really took their oath seriously, and the Oath of Tyndareus was a brilliant strategic move to ensure all the major players would be obligated to fight for Helen's husband, whoever he turned out to be. It was like a prenuptial agreement, but with swords and sieges. So the Greek armada, a formidable sight of 1,000 ships, is assembled at Aulis, ready to sail for Troy and bring justice, or at least vengeance, to Paris and his city. Agamemnon, the mighty commander-in-chief, stands at the head of this vast host, his glory seemingly assured. But the curse, that relentless family specter, wasn't about to let him have an easy departure. The winds, you see, refused to blow. Not a gentle breeze, not a soft gust, nothing. The ships were becalmed, stuck in the harbor, their sails flapping uselessly day after agonizing day. The warriors grew restless, supplies dwindled, and morale plummeted faster than a lead zeppelin. This wasn't just bad weather, this was divine intervention, a clear sign that the gods were displeased. The frustrated Greeks consulted the prophet Calchas, a man whose job it was to tell you exactly why the gods were mad, usually with incredibly inconvenient answers. Calchas, after much divination and probably a fair bit of sweating under the collar, delivered the grim news: the goddess Artemis was offended. Why Artemis? Well, there are a couple of versions of this rather unfortunate tidbit. One says Agamemnon had boasted that he was a better hunter than Artemis herself, a classic case of hubris that, as we've seen, rarely ends well for anyone in this family. Another more widely accepted version suggests he had offended her by killing a sacred stag in her grove, or perhaps even worse, that his father Atreus had failed to sacrifice a golden lamb to her, thus carrying on the legacy of neglecting divine duties. Historians still argue whether the Iliad's portrayal of Agamemnon's hubris is the primary cause or simply a convenient narrative device to explain the goddess's wrath. Regardless of the exact reason, Artemis was royally miffed, and she was the one holding the wind hostage. And what did Artemis demand as appeasement? A sacrifice, a human sacrifice, specifically Iphigenia, Agamemnon's eldest daughter. Yes, the gods apparently had a thing for extreme measures when they felt disrespected. Imagine that conversation. Commander, the goddess demands your daughter to get the winds blowing. It's the kind of request that makes you seriously consider a career change, perhaps to goat herding. Agamemnon was naturally torn. This was an agonizing choice: sacrifice his own child, or condemn his entire expedition to failure, lose face before all of Greece, and potentially spark a mutiny. The fate of the entire Greek campaign rested on his shoulders. The weight of his oath to Menelaus, the desire for glory, and the immense pressure from his assembled allies eventually outweighed his paternal love. He made the horrific decision to proceed with the sacrifice. He sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, back in Mycenae, luring Iphigenia to Aulis under the false pretense that she was to be married to the great hero Achilles. Can you even imagine the cold calculation, the deceit involved in that lie? Clytemnestra, overjoyed at the prospect of her daughter marrying such a renowned warrior, brought Iphigenia to the camp. When Iphigenia arrived, dressed in her wedding finery, she quickly realized the horrific truth. The altar was not for a wedding, but for a sacrifice. The joy turned to terror, the celebratory atmosphere to one of chilling dread. Achilles, initially furious that his name had been used in such a deceitful manner, tried to protect her, but the combined force of the army's will and divine mandate was too strong. Agamemnon, perhaps weeping, perhaps stoic, but undeniably a man caught in a terrible trap of his own making, or his ancestors' making, allowed the ritual to proceed. And so Iphigenia was led to the altar. Some versions of the myth say she was stoic and brave, accepting her fate for the sake of Greece. Others describe her pleading distraught. But at the last moment, in a poignant and rather convenient twist, Artemis intervened. Just as the knife was about to fall, the goddess spirited Iphigenia away, replacing her with a deer or a stag on the altar. Iphigenia was then taken to Taurus to serve as a priestess in Artemis's temple, essentially given a new life, albeit one far from home. A quirky or fringe tidbit, this rescue often gets overlooked in the darker retellings, yet it shows a moment of divine compassion amidst the relentless tragedy. However, the fact that she was replaced by a deer was kept secret from most of the Greeks, and critically from her mother Clytemnestra. To Clytemnestra, her beloved daughter was brutally murdered by her own father for the sake of a war over another woman. This act, this unimaginable sacrifice, became the profound, unyielding source of Clytemnestra's burning hatred for Agamemnon, setting the stage for the next terrible act of vengeance in the cursed family line. The winds may have blown, and the ships may have sailed for Troy, but the dark storm of Clytemnestra's wrath was just beginning to brew, guaranteeing that Agamemnon's eventual return would be anything but triumphant. With Iphigenia's sacrifice, or perceived sacrifice for Clytemnestra's purposes, complete, and the winds finally blowing, the vast Greek fleet at last set sail from Aulis, leaving behind a grieving mother and a father burdened by an impossible choice. Their destination: Troy, a formidable city across the Aegean Sea, renowned for its impenetrable walls and powerful allies. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief from the assembled army as the sails finally billowed, propelling them towards their destiny, unaware that they were merely exchanging one set of problems for a decade-long grind of a lifetime. The Trojan War, as you might recall from your high school history class or various epic films, wasn't a quick smash-and-grab operation. Oh no, this was the ancient world's equivalent of a never-ending siege, a protracted, grinding conflict that lasted for 10 grueling years. Imagine being stuck in a perpetual camping trip, but with constant danger, questionable sanitation, and a very aggressive opposition. It must have been utterly mind-numbing for the rank and file, even for the legendary heroes. From the moment the Greeks landed on the beaches of Troy, the conflict was relentless. It wasn't just about large-scale battles. It was a constant stream of skirmishes, duels between heroes, raids on surrounding territories for supplies, and the agonizing wait for a decisive victory that never seemed to come. The Trojan walls, built according to myth, with the help of the gods, Poseidon and Apollo, proved truly impregnable. The Greeks tried everything: direct assault, siege engines, probably even trying to negotiate a peace treaty that fell apart over who got to keep the golden apple. Just kidding, mostly. The war saw the rise and fall of countless heroes on both sides. On the Greek side, you had Achilles, the near-invincible warrior with the infamous heel; Odysseus, the cunning strategist; Ajax, the mighty brute; and of course, Agamemnon, leading them all. On the Trojan side, there was Hector, the noble and valiant prince, Troy's greatest champion; Paris, the instigator of it all, and probably not too popular with his own people by year 7; and Aeneas, a survivor who would later found Rome, which is a neat little historical Easter egg for anyone paying attention. Agamemnon, as the supreme commander, bore the immense weight of leadership throughout these 10 years. He had to manage the egos of powerful, often quarrelsome heroes. Achilles famously withdrew from battle for a significant period due to a dispute with Agamemnon over a captured woman. Briseis, a true testament to Agamemnon's diplomatic skills, or lack thereof. He had to maintain discipline, secure supplies, and constantly rally a weary army. It was a monumental task, and despite his flaws, he largely succeeded in keeping the coalition together for a decade. It's like trying to herd cats, but the cats are all demigods with sharp swords and even sharper tempers. The conflict wasn't just physical. It was a battle of wits, prophecy, and divine favor. Gods openly took sides, interfering in battles, manipulating events, and generally making a nuisance of themselves. This was less a war and more a celestial reality show, with mortals as the pawns. The human cost was immense: lives lost by the 1,000 cities plundered and families shattered. The very landscape around Troy became steeped in blood and sorrow. A mainstream historical fact. The late Bronze Age collapse, roughly spanning 1200–1150 BCE, saw the widespread destruction of major civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, including the Mycenaean palaces, the Hittite Empire, and cities in the Levant. While the Trojan War, if historical, might have been one localized conflict, it occurred within a broader period of immense turmoil, migration, and societal breakdown that still puzzles historians. Was it climate change, internal revolts, foreign invaders, like the enigmatic Sea Peoples, or a combination of factors? Historians still argue whether the Iliad's depiction of a protracted siege reflects actual Bronze Age siege tactics, or is largely a poetic embellishment. Regardless the war's extended duration and ultimate destructive power fit the larger, darker narrative of this historical period. Through it all, the curse of the Atreides lingered a silent observer. Agamemnon might have been leading armies and winning battles, but the seeds of his own destruction, sown by his ancestors and watered by his own terrible choice at Aulis, were patiently waiting to bloom. The glory of victory, should it ever come, would be fleeting, a mere prelude to the bitter, bloody end that awaited him back home. After 10 grueling years of siege skirmishes and the occasional divine intervention that really just made things more complicated, the Greeks were no closer to breaching Troy's formidable walls. The morale of the troops, even for battle-hardened veterans like Odysseus, was starting to fray. They were tired, homesick, and probably developing some serious issues with the local food. It seemed the mighty city of Troy, despite facing the combined might of the Achaean forces, was destined to stand. But then, Odysseus, the famously cunning and resourceful king of Ithaca, cooked up a plan so audacious, so deceptively brilliant, that it could only have been born from a mind accustomed to outsmarting monsters and navigating divine wrath. He proposed the Trojan horse. The idea was simple in its genius: a massive, hollow wooden horse, seemingly left behind as a votive offering to Athena, or perhaps a peace offering, while the entire Greek fleet appeared to abandon the siege and sail away. It was the ultimate psychological operation designed to exploit the Trojans' piety and their desperate desire for the war to end. Imagine the murmuring among the Greek ranks. A giant wooden horse. Really, Odysseus, have you been hitting the ambrosia a bit too hard? But Agamemnon, perhaps sensing the desperation of the hour, or simply trusting Odysseus's reputation for cleverness, gave the nod. The Greeks constructed the enormous horse, a feat of ancient engineering that must have taken quite a bit of effort. Think of it as the ultimate DIY project, but with much higher stakes. Inside its hollow belly, a select group of the bravest and most skilled Greek warriors, including Odysseus himself and even Menelaus, hid in cramped, suffocating silence. The rest of the Greek army packed up their camp, burned their tents, and sailed their ships out of sight just far enough to be hidden by a nearby island, creating the perfect illusion of retreat. It was a masterclass in ancient naval deception, almost as impressive as that time they convinced the Cyclops that nobody was attacking him. The Trojans, waking to an empty Greek camp and a colossal wooden horse on their plain, were understandably ecstatic. The war was over. They poured out of their gates, cheering, laughing, probably doing a little celebratory dance. They found a lone Greek Sinon, who had been left behind to spin a convincing tale. Sinon, a master of deception, or just a very good actor, claimed he had escaped the Greeks, who had left the horse as an offering to appease Athena for having defiled her temple, and that it was too large to be taken into the city, lest it bring fortune to Troy. He expertly manipulated their superstitions and their desire for peace. Even the prophet Laocoon, who famously cried, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," and threw a spear at the horse, was silenced when two giant sea serpents, sent by the pro-Greek gods, emerged from the sea and devoured him and his sons. Talk about a dramatic exit, and a very clear sign to the Trojans that they should probably ignore any remaining skepticism, despite some warnings from the prophetess Cassandra, whose prophecies were always true, but never believed. A truly terrible gift the Trojans convinced by Sinon, and the ominous fate of Laocoon dragged the colossal wooden horse inside their city walls. They celebrated late into the night, feasting, drinking, completely unaware of the deadly cargo within their supposed trophy. It was a scene of unparalleled irony and foreshadowing. As the city slept drunk and exhausted from their celebrations, the Greek warriors emerged from the horse's belly. Imagine the stealth required, the tension of that moment, quietly unbarring the city gates from the inside. They lit signal fires to guide the returning Greek fleet, which had secretly sailed back under the cover of darkness. The unsuspecting city of Troy was then subjected to a brutal, merciless sack. The Greek soldiers, fueled by 10 years of pent-up frustration and the desire for vengeance, showed no mercy. The city burned its people, slaughtered its treasures, plundered. It was a devastating end for a proud civilization. This systematic destruction of Troy, a mainstream historical fact in the sense that archaeological evidence points to multiple layers of destruction at the site of Hisarlik, particularly one around the supposed time of the Trojan War, marked the end of the long conflict. But for Agamemnon, the victory was hollow, stained by the lingering curse. He had achieved his goal. He had led the Greeks to triumph, but the seeds of his own destruction, planted by the sacrifice of Iphigenia and nurtured by Clytemnestra's burning hatred, were now fully mature. Historians still argue about the precise tactics of ancient warfare. Was such a massive, sustained siege truly feasible? Or is the Trojan horse a purely mythological invention, a symbolic representation of cunning over brute force, regardless its impact on the narrative of the Atreides family, and specifically Agamemnon's fate, was catastrophic. His triumphant return home would be anything but. The mighty city of Troy lay in ruins, a smoldering testament to Greek vengeance and the cunning of Odysseus. Agamemnon, the High King, finally achieved his long-sought victory, standing amidst the ashes of his enemy's capital. You'd think, wouldn't you, that after 10 brutal years of war and the utter annihilation of Troy, he would be due for a triumphant hero's welcome. A parade, laurel wreaths, perhaps a nice, relaxing bath, and a truly uninterrupted meal. But for Agamemnon, a man living under the enduring shadow of the Atreides' cursed triumph, was merely a prelude to tragedy. His journey home, the Nostos, or return voyage, would be fraught with peril, culminating in the most devastating betrayal of all. The journey itself was not without its challenges. The Greek fleet scattered by storms, some say sent by angry gods, specifically Athena, who felt the Greeks had shown insufficient piety in their sack of Troy, faced numerous perils. Many heroes had long winding and often fatal voyages back to their homelands. Odysseus, as you might recall, had perhaps the most epic and frustrating commute home in history, taking another 10 years, filled with monsters, sirens, and angry gods. Agamemnon, however, seemed to have a relatively swift passage, almost suspiciously smooth, as if fate were rushing him towards his grim destiny. As his ship finally approached the shores of Mycenae, Agamemnon must have felt a swell of relief and pride. He was returning not just as a king, but as a legendary conqueror, the man who had led all of Greece to victory. He brought with him a considerable amount of treasure from Troy, and controversially, the Trojan princess Cassandra as his war prize. Now, Cassandra was not just any princess. She was a prophetess, blessed with the gift of prophecy by Apollo, but cursed by him after she rejected his advances, never to be believed. Imagine having the ability to see the future, but everyone just pats you on the head and says, there, dear, now, isn't that a lovely doom you're predicting?" She foresaw Agamemnon's murder and tried desperately to warn him, but of course no one listened. It's like watching a horror movie where the victim knows exactly what's coming, but just can't get anyone to take them seriously. Meanwhile, back in Mycenae, things had been far from quiet. During Agamemnon's decade-long absence, his wife, Clytemnestra, had stewed in her grief and rage over the perceived sacrifice of Iphigenia. Her initial sorrow had festered into an icy, unyielding hatred. She felt utterly betrayed by her husband, who had chosen war and glory over their daughter's life. And in her bitterness, she had taken a lover, Aegisthus, the very man who had killed Agamemnon's father, Atreus. Yes, the curse loved to keep things in the family, didn't it? It's almost too perfectly symmetrical. Aegisthus avenging his father by killing Atreus, and now conspiring with Clytemnestra to avenge her daughter by killing Agamemnon. The ancestral hatred, it seems, was a remarkably good matchmaker. Aegisthus, having been driven out by Agamemnon years prior, had seized this opportunity for both revenge and power. He and Clytemnestra had formed a dark alliance, patiently awaiting Agamemnon's return, meticulously planning his demise. They had set up watchmen on the highest points, ready to light signal fires the moment the fleet was sighted, a seemingly joyful beacon of victory that was in reality a signal for murder. When Agamemnon finally stepped ashore full of the triumph of Troy, he was met not with genuine celebration, but with a meticulously orchestrated welcome by Clytemnestra. She outwardly played the role of the devoted wife, laying out purple tapestries for him to walk on, a highly symbolic act, as purple was reserved for gods and triumphant conquerors, bordering on sacrilege, if you weren't careful, showering him with praise. But beneath the surface, the trap was set. The exact method of his murder varies slightly in different accounts. Some say Clytemnestra, often with Aegisthus's help, struck him down in his bath, entangled in a net unable to defend himself. Others depict a more direct confrontation. Regardless of the precise details, the outcome was the same. Agamemnon, the great conqueror of Troy, was brutally murdered in his own home by his own wife upon his glorious return. Cassandra, the prophetess, also met her grim end at Clytemnestra's hands. A mainstream historical fact, the concept of the returns nostoi of the Greek heroes from Troy was a significant theme in ancient Greek epic poetry, second only to the Trojan War itself. These tales explored the challenges of homecoming, the shifting loyalties, and the divine retributions faced by those returning from war. Historians still argue about how much these stories reflect the real challenges faced by ancient warriors returning from long campaigns versus their purely mythological function. The killing of Agamemnon by Clytemnestra upon his return, a quintessential element of the nostoi, perfectly embodies the enduring destructive power of the Atreides curse. His glory, hard-won and immense, proved to be nothing more than a fleeting moment before the dark cycle spun onward. So Agamemnon, the mighty commander of the Achaean forces, falls not on the fields of Troy, but in the supposed safety of his own home at the hands of his own wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. The irony is as thick as a Vietnamese coffee on a hot afternoon. He survived a decade of brutal warfare, only to be undone by the simmering vengeance of a woman he had deeply wronged. This act was not simply a crime of passion. It was the culmination of years of suppressed rage, a calculated and brutal act of Clytemnestra's vengeance, a direct, horrifying echo of the very curses that had plagued her husband's bloodline. Clytemnestra's motives were clear, at least to her. From her perspective, Agamemnon had sacrificed their beloved daughter Iphigenia on the altar for the sake of a fair wind and a war over another woman. She had never forgiven him, and a decade of waiting, coupled with Aegisthus's influence and his own thirst for retribution against Atreus's line, had only hardened her resolve. She saw herself not as a murderer, but as an instrument of justice, a furious mother reclaiming her dignity and avenging her child. She felt no guilt, no remorse, only a grim satisfaction that the scales had finally been balanced. You can almost hear her defiant monologue, justifying every bloody step, though you might disagree with her methods. With Agamemnon dead, Aegisthus ascended to the throne of Mycenae. For a time it seemed as though the curse had finally found its comfortable resting place with him and Clytemnestra, ruling together. They held power, ostensibly bringing stability to a kingdom that had just seen its king return victorious, only to be immediately dispatched. They probably thought they had broken the cycle, or at least redirected it. But curses, especially ancient Greek ones, are rarely so easily contained. They have a nasty habit of finding a way to continue the drama. Clytemnestra ruled with a strong hand alongside Aegisthus for roughly 7 years. Their reign, however, was built on a foundation of parricide and usurpation, a fact that would not sit well with many, particularly the surviving children of Agamemnon. The public sentiment, while initially perhaps accepting of a new order after the long war, would likely have been simmering with discontent over such a brazen act of regicide. A quirky tidbit in some versions of the myth, Clytemnestra is portrayed as a dominant, almost masculine figure, contrasting sharply with the traditional expectations of Greek women, emphasizing her transgressive role in the murder. The murder of Agamemnon and Cassandra was a seismic event, sending shockwaves through the very fabric of the divine and mortal worlds. It was an act of betrayal within the most sacred of bonds, marriage and family. It was also an affront to the heroic ideal the conquering king laid low, not by a mighty foe in battle, but by treachery in his own home. This was a deep, profound violation of xenia, the Greek concept of hospitality and guest friendship usually applied to guests, but here inverted within the family itself. This event directly sets the stage for the next terrible act in the family saga, the vengeance of Agamemnon's children. The cycle wasn't broken. It had simply shifted gears, waiting for the next generation to pick up the bloody mantle. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus may have thought they were secure, but they had merely added another layer to the already dense and festering curse. Their act ensured that the cycle of retributive violence would continue, dragging down the next generation of the Atreides, a mainstream historical fact. In ancient Greece, particularly during the archaic and classical periods, the concept of blood guilt was incredibly powerful. A murder, especially within the family or against a ruler, was believed to create a spiritual pollution that could affect the entire community until proper vengeance or atonement was made. This societal belief provided the mythological justification for the relentless pursuit of justice by the Furies and the moral imperative for characters like Orestes. Historians still argue about the precise evolution of legal and moral concepts from primitive blood feuds to more formalized justice systems, as seen in the Oresteia. For Clytemnestra, her act, while justified in her eyes, simultaneously placed her at the very heart of this ancient, inescapable cycle of blood for blood. Her triumph was in fact her doom. So Clytemnestra and Aegisthus rule Mycenae, basking in their ill-gotten power, seemingly secure in their bloody triumph over Agamemnon. But the curse, like a bad recurring dream, was merely biding its time, waiting for the right moment to twist the knife again. Agamemnon had 3 surviving children, Electra, Chrysothemis, and Orestes. It's Orestes, the young prince who would bear the agonizing burden of the next act of vengeance, destined to become the most tragic figure in this entire lamentable lineage. At the time of Agamemnon's murder, Orestes was still a young boy, perhaps just a child, seeing the writing on the wall, or perhaps foreseeing his grim fate, his older sister Electra, or sometimes a loyal nurse, managed to spirit him away from Mycenae. He was sent into exile, specifically to the court of King Strophius in Phocis, where he was raised alongside Strophius's own son, Pylades. This exile was a crucial detail, protecting him from Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, who undoubtedly would have eliminated him to consolidate their power. It was like sending a future king to a boarding school, but the curriculum was less about Latin and more about biding your time until you could stage a bloody coup. Orestes grew up in a foreign land, haunted by the stories of his father's glorious life and brutal death. He was constantly reminded of the injustice, the usurpation of his throne, and the murder of his royal father at the hands of his own mother and her lover. This isn't your average childhood trauma. This is the stuff of ancient Greek tragedy, a weight of expectation that would crush most mortals. He was heir to a throne, yes, but also heir to a curse, a legacy of violence that demanded a terrible price. As Orestes matured into a young man, the pressure to avenge his father grew immense. It wasn't just a personal desire. It was a societal and religious imperative. In ancient Greek belief, a murdered man's ghost cried out for vengeance, and only the proper retaliation by a blood relative could appease it and lift the miasma or spiritual pollution from the land. The Furies, those terrifying goddesses of vengeance, would pursue those who committed kin murder, but they also punished those who failed to avenge kin murder. It was a lose-lose situation, truly. You're damned if you do, and damned if you don't, which is quite the pickle for a young prince. To complicate matters, Orestes, much like his ancestors, sought guidance from the Oracle of Delphi. He asked Apollo through his priestess whether he should avenge his father's death by killing his mother. The oracle's response was unequivocal. He must avenge Agamemnon, and if he didn't, he would face terrible divine wrath and suffer from diseases, madness, and perpetual exile. Talk about peer pressure. This direct divine command pushed Orestes into an impossible moral dilemma. Kill his own mother, matricide, an act considered one of the most heinous crimes, or suffer eternal torment and divine punishment. Historians still argue about the philosophical implications of this double bind in Greek tragedy, where characters are forced to choose between two seemingly impossible and equally terrible outcomes. So armed with this terrifying divine mandate and accompanied by his loyal cousin and best friend, Pylades, whose unwavering support is one of the few glimmers of true loyalty in this cursed narrative, Orestes eventually returned to Mycenae. He returned in secret, in disguise, to avoid detection by Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, who would surely try to eliminate him. He probably had to sneak past the guards like a particularly anxious ninja, except his weapon was filial duty and a divine imperative. His return marked the beginning of the final agonizing phase of the curse's grip on the house of Atreus. The young prince, who had been spared death as a child, was now compelled to commit the ultimate act of familial violence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only determine the fate of Mycenae, but also crucially challenge the very nature of justice in the ancient world. The weight of generations of grief, betrayal, and bloodshed was about to culminate in Orestes' terrible choice. Orestes has returned to Mycenae, driven by the oracle's terrifying command, his loyal companion Pylades at his side. He's operating in stealth, a phantom from the past, ready to unleash a future no one truly desires. But he wasn't alone in his simmering grief and thirst for justice. His sister Electra had remained in Mycenae, enduring the oppressive reign of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. Her story is one of unwavering loyalty and profound sorrow, a constant living testament to the injustice that had befallen her father. Electra's life under her mother and Aegisthus was, to put it mildly, miserable. She was kept under close watch, treated more like a prisoner than a princess. Her royal status was diminished. Her marriage prospects ruined all because she openly grieved for her murdered father and refused to acknowledge Clytemnestra and Aegisthus's legitimacy. She was a constant thorn in their side, a living reproach, a daily reminder of their crime. Imagine living in a house where the people who murdered your dad are having a great time, and you're stuck doing chores while seething with resentment. It's enough to make anyone a little dramatic. Electra clung fiercely to the memory of her father, Agamemnon, and to the hope of Orestes' return. She constantly mourned, refusing to put on a brave face, often wearing simple, somber clothes as a public display of her grief and defiance. Her lamentations and criticisms were a source of constant irritation for Clytemnestra, who deep down must have been tormented by the echoes of her own actions. Electra's unwavering loyalty wasn't just passive. It was an active form of psychological warfare against her mother and Aegisthus, a daily reminder of their guilt. It was Electra who first recognized Orestes upon his secret return. Their reunion is often depicted as incredibly emotional, a powerful moment of shared grief and renewed hope. You can almost feel the tension, the years of unspoken longing and shared pain suddenly bursting forth. For Electra, Orestes wasn't just her brother. He was the avenger, the destined instrument of their father's justice, the key to finally bringing an end to her prolonged suffering. She became his most fervent supporter, relentlessly encouraging him, pushing him towards the terrible act he was destined to commit. Her conviction bolstered his own, helping him overcome his natural hesitation at the prospect of matricide. Electra's role is crucial in understanding the psychological weight on Orestes. She didn't just welcome him. She became his conscience, his relentless goad, reminding him of his duty, of the oracle's command, of their father's unavenged spirit. Do not falter, brother. You can almost hear her whisper, her voice, thin but sharp, with years of pain. Remember, our Father. Remember, Iphigenia. She was the one who ensured he would not stray from his grim path, turning his internal conflict into a shared externalized imperative. A quirky or fringe tidbit. The myth of Electra, particularly as dramatized by playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides, introduces an interesting psychological dynamic that has even inspired modern psychoanalytic concepts, such as the Electra complex, a female counterpart to the Oedipus complex, describing a daughter's unconscious sexual desire for her father and rivalry with her mother. While not a direct psychological diagnosis in the classical sense, it highlights the intense familial relationships and emotional conflicts depicted in these ancient myths. The collaboration between Orestes and Electra was a partnership forged in grief and vengeance. It underscores the profound impact of the curse, how it warped family bonds, turning siblings into co-conspirators in a grand tragic design. They meticulously planned their moves, perhaps with the silent approval of the returning Greek veterans, who would have still felt a powerful loyalty to their fallen commander. This moment with Orestes and Electra uniting represented the convergence of personal vengeance and divine decree. A mainstream historical fact, familial loyalty and vengeance were incredibly strong societal norms in ancient Greece. While formal legal systems existed, personal retribution, particularly for murder, was often seen as a moral obligation. The concept of blood guilt, necessitating blood vengeance, was deeply ingrained, and stories like the Oresteia, the dramatic trilogy that tells Orestes' story, explore the tension between these ancient customs and the emergence of more formalized justice. Historians still argue about the extent to which these myths reflect actual legal practices or serve as commentaries on evolving societal ethics regarding justice and punishment. But for Electra, the only justice that mattered was the one wielded by her brother's hand, and that hand was now poised to strike. The moment of truth has arrived. Orestes, guided by the oracle of Delphi and bolstered by Electra's unwavering resolve, stands on the precipice of an act that will define his life and the ongoing tragedy of the house of Atreus, the murder of his own mother, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was a meticulously planned execution, a grim duty demanded by gods and ghosts alike. You can almost feel the oppressive weight of fate pressing down on Orestes, pushing him towards this unspeakable deed. Orestes, along with Pylades, approached the palace in Mycenae, under the guise of strangers, messengers, bringing news of Orestes' supposed death. This elaborate deception was designed to gain entry and catch Clytemnestra and Aegisthus off guard. Imagine the chilling scene: Orestes, forced to lie about his own demise, watching his mother's reaction, perhaps a flicker of relief mixed with feigned sorrow. It's the kind of emotional manipulation that leaves a bad taste in your mouth, even if you understand the dire necessity. First Orestes and Pylades dealt with Aegisthus. Aegisthus, perhaps less cautious than he should have been, welcomed the messengers, bearing news that seemed to confirm his long-held security on the throne. He probably saw it as the final convenient removal of any threat to his power. When Aegisthus was alone, Orestes, with Pylades' assistance, struck him down. It was a swift act of retribution, fulfilling the direct vengeance for Agamemnon's murder, and, by extension, the ongoing vendetta initiated by Aegisthus' own father, Thyestes, against Atreus. The killer of his father was dead, a significant hurdle overcome. But the more agonizing task lay ahead, the confrontation with his mother, Clytemnestra. This was no mere political assassination. This was matricide, an act considered one of the most heinous crimes against both mortal and divine law. When Clytemnestra appeared, perhaps drawn by the commotion, or perhaps simply by ill fate, she recognized Orestes. The shock, the horror, the dawning realization of her impending doom must have been overwhelming. She pleaded with him, appealing to his filial duty, showing him the breast that had nursed him, begging him to spare her life. This moment is often depicted as the dramatic climax of the entire saga, a profound moral dilemma. Orestes hesitated. His hand wavered. Could he truly bring himself to kill the woman who bore him? It was Pylades, ever loyal and pragmatic, who intervened, reminding Orestes of his oath of Apollo's command, of the unavenged ghost of his father. Where, then, are Apollo's oracles, if not now? He might have urged pulling Orestes back from the brink of abandoning his terrible destiny. Strengthened by this reminder of his sacred duty, Orestes steeled himself and committed the act. He plunged his sword into Clytemnestra, killing her, finally bringing retribution for Agamemnon's murder, and in his mind, for the sacrifice of Iphigenia. The palace, already steeped in the blood of generations, now witnessed its most agonizing, necessary, and tragic act. With Clytemnestra's death, the direct cycle of vengeance within the Atreides family, from Tantalus to Atreus to Agamemnon, seemed to culminate. A quirky or fringe tidbit. The motif of the disguised avenger returning home is a common one in mythology and folklore found across various cultures. Think of Odysseus's return to Ithaca, or even elements in Shakespeare. It underscores the danger and complexity of personal justice in societies without robust legal systems. This act, while fulfilling the oracle's decree and appeasing his father's ghost, immediately plunged Orestes into a new kind of torment. The Furies, those ancient, terrifying goddesses born from the blood of Uranus and embodying vengeance for kin murder, would not let this matricide go unpunished. They were the relentless hounds of conscience, the terrifying embodiment of blood guilt. Orestes had committed a necessary evil, but evil it still was, and the consequences would be swift and brutal. A mainstream historical fact. The concept of matricide was universally abhorrent in ancient Greek society, viewed as one of the most sacrilegious acts a human could commit, disrupting the very fabric of social and cosmic order. The dramatic and psychological tension surrounding Orestes' choice reflects this profound societal taboo. Historians still argue about how much the myths of Orestes reflect an evolving understanding of justice, moving from primitive blood feud to more formalized legal processes. For now, however, Orestes had shed the blood of his mother, and the terrifying consequences of that act were about to descend upon him. Orestes has committed the unthinkable. He has murdered his mother, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. The palace of Mycenae is silent once more. But this time, it's not the silence of peace, but the chilling stillness that follows a hurricane. He might have expected a moment of triumph, a sense of relief, or perhaps even the immediate lifting of the curse that had plagued his family for generations. Instead, what descended upon him was something far more terrifying and utterly relentless: the Furies. Immediately after the matricide, as the blood was still fresh on his hands, Orestes began to see them, not as figments of his imagination born from guilt, though the line between external manifestation and internal torment in Greek myth is always wonderfully blurry. No, these were real. The Furies, or Erinyes as they were also known, are ancient chthonic goddesses born from the blood of Uranus when Cronus castrated him. They are formidable, terrifying beings with snakes for hair wings and eyes that drip venom or blood. They exist to punish those who commit kin murder, those who violate sacred oaths, and those who cause fundamental disorder within the family and societal structure. Think of them as the ancient Greek divine police force, but with a much more aggressive pursuit policy and a complete disregard for due process. They are the embodiment of unappeased vengeance, the living conscience of a society that believed blood spilled unjustly demanded blood in return. From the moment he committed the matricide, the Furies attached themselves to Orestes. Like grim, spectral shadows, they pursued him relentlessly, their terrifying presence driving him to madness. Their whispers filled his ears, accusing him, condemning him, reminding him of his horrific deed. He was hounded wherever he went, unable to find rest, unable to escape their tormenting gaze. Imagine trying to sleep with a chorus of ancient snake-haired deities chanting about your mother's blood, constantly reminding you of your parricidal acts. It's enough to make anyone lose their mind, which incidentally was often the Furies' preferred method of punishment. This pursuit was not merely psychological. It was physical, tangible. Orestes was driven from Mycenae, forced into a state of perpetual flight, an outcast, shunned by society, his very presence radiating the miasma of blood guilt. He wandered across Greece, a solitary, desperate figure trying to find purification, trying to escape the relentless tormentors who were slowly but surely stripping him of his sanity. This is a classic example of divine retribution in Greek myth. The gods might have commanded the act, but they certainly didn't promise a pleasant aftermath. A mainstream historical fact. The concept of the Furies, Erinyes, underscores the profound fear of blood guilt and the social consequences of unpunished crimes in ancient Greece. While their mythological depiction is fantastical, they represent very real societal pressures and anxieties surrounding justice, retribution, and the spiritual well-being of the community. In ancient Athens, for example, certain legal cases involving homicide were brought before the Areopagus, a council that served as a kind of supreme court for serious crimes, suggesting a move towards formalized justice from earlier blood feuds. Orestes' plight resonated deeply with Greek audiences because it grappled with an unbearable paradox, a divine command to commit an act that, by its very nature, incurred divine punishment. He was caught in an impossible bind, a tragic figure caught between the explicit word of Apollo and the primal, unforgiving law of the Furies. Historians still argue about whether this myth represents a critique of the old eye for an eye system of justice or a complex exploration of moral responsibility when faced with conflicting divine imperatives. Regardless, Orestes' torment was a clear demonstration that even fulfilling a god's command did not absolve one from the natural, horrific consequences of certain actions. His only hope lay in appealing to a higher authority, in seeking a purification or a judgment that could finally appease the Furies and break the cycle of violence that had consumed his family for generations. He sought sanctuary, sought a trial, sought anything that could bring an end to the relentless, soul-destroying pursuit. And that search would lead him to the very heart of Athenian justice, to a climactic trial that would determine not only his fate, but perhaps the future of justice itself. Hounded by the relentless Furies, Orestes' sanity was slipping away. He wandered, desperate, across the ancient world, seeking refuge, seeking purification, seeking anything that would lift the torment that gnawed at his very soul. He appealed to various deities, performed rites of purification, but nothing seemed to appease the ancient goddesses of vengeance. Their whispers were constant. Their snake hair hissed in his periphery, and their eyes, eternally fixed on him, promised no respite. This was no simple bout of guilt. This was a divine, persistent haunting, a literal embodiment of his terrible deed. His journey eventually led him to the most sacred of places, the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi. It was, after all, Apollo who had commanded him to commit the matricide in the first place, thus placing Orestes in this impossible predicament. You can almost picture him, haggard and wild-eyed, stumbling into the serene temple, collapsing before the Pythia, demanding answers. Apollo, feeling some responsibility for the predicament he had orchestrated, or perhaps just tired of the Furies making a ruckus near his sacred site, finally offered Orestes a path to salvation. He must go to Athens and stand trial before a newly established court, presided over by none other than the goddess Athena herself. This was a groundbreaking development. Up until this point, justice for kin murder was largely a matter of blood feud, an endless cycle of an eye for an eye, with the Furies serving as the primary enforcers of this ancient law. But Apollo, representing a newer, more rational Olympian order of justice, sought to establish a different system, one based on reasoned debate and legal process rather than primal retribution. It's like moving from a frontier town where everyone carries a gun to a bustling city with a proper court system. A definite upgrade, though the transition could be messy. So Orestes, still pursued by the Furies, who were absolutely fuming at the idea of their ancient domain being challenged, made his way to Athens. The city then, as now, was a beacon of burgeoning democracy and intellectual thought. Upon his arrival, a trial was convened on the Areopagus, a rocky hill near the Acropolis, which historically served as the site for the Supreme Judicial Council of Athens, handling cases of homicide and other serious crimes. This isn't just a mythological setting. The Areopagus was a very real, very important institution in Athenian legal history, signifying the city's commitment to ordered justice. The trial itself was a grand symbolic event, often considered the philosophical climax of Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy. On one side stood Orestes, defended by Apollo, who argued that Orestes was merely an instrument of divine will, fulfilling his sacred duty to avenge his father. Apollo emphasized that the paternal line Agamemnon was more important than the maternal Clytemnestra, a very patriarchal argument that reflects the social norms of the time. You can imagine the dramatic tension, Apollo perhaps thundering his arguments, the Furies hissing and circling. On the other side stood the Furies themselves, serving as the prosecution. They argued vehemently for the ancient law of blood vengeance, asserting their primal right to punish matricide, the most grievous of crimes against the blood bond. They highlighted the sanctity of the mother-child relationship, demanding Orestes' life as atonement for his unforgivable act. Their arguments were visceral, raw, appealing to the fundamental ancient fear of transgressing sacred familial ties. It was less a legal argument and more an angry guttural demand for retribution. The jury was composed of 12 Athenian citizens, specifically chosen by Athena, and presiding over it all was Athena herself, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, symbolizing the impartial arbiter, the voice of reason. Historians still argue about the extent to which Aeschylus's play reflects a historical transition in Athenian law, from blood feuds to state-administered justice, or whether it's primarily a mythological justification for the legitimacy of the Areopagus court. Regardless, this trial was more than just about Orestes. It was a cosmic debate about the nature of justice law and the transition from primitive retribution to a more civilized legal framework. The tension was palpable. The fate of Orestes and perhaps the future of justice itself, hung in the balance. The vote of the jury was cast, and it was remarkably tied, a perfect deadlock reflecting the agonizing complexity of Orestes' moral dilemma. The curse of the Atreides, having driven so much bloodshed, seemed to defy a simple resolution even by divine decree. But Athena, as the presiding judge, held the decisive vote. So, the trial on the Areopagus reaches its climax. The arguments have been made, Apollo advocating for Orestes and the new order of justice, emphasizing paternal lineage and divine command, and the Furies roaring for their ancient right to punish matricide, demanding blood for blood. The jury of Athenian citizens, caught between these powerful conflicting forces, casts its votes, and the result is a perfect, agonizing tie. You can feel the collective gasp, the tension hanging thick in the air, a silence broken only by the low guttural growls of the Furies, impatient for their prey. This deadlock meant that the fate of Orestes, and indeed the very nature of justice in the cosmos, rested squarely on the shoulders of one goddess, Athena. Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and, conveniently for Orestes, a staunch supporter of the nascent Athenian legal system, now had the deciding vote. She stepped forward, her presence commanding attention even from the ancient enraged Furies. Her judgment was not just a legal ruling, it was a profound philosophical statement, a pivotal moment in the evolution of justice in Greek mythology. Athena's reasoning was layered. First, she acknowledged the validity of both sides. She understood the ancient claim of the Furies, the primal need for retribution for such a heinous crime as matricide. She recognized the profound sacredness of the mother-child bond. But she also weighed Apollo's argument regarding the father's role and Orestes' divine compulsion. Crucially, she cast her vote for Orestes, effectively acquitting him. Her decision was rooted in several key points. She declared that the father was the true parent, providing the seed of life, while the mother was merely the vessel, a biological incubator. A rather convenient and patriarchal stance that certainly simplified matters for a male-dominated society, wouldn't you say? This argument directly undermined the Furies' claim that matricide was the ultimate sin, placing the father's life, and therefore Agamemnon's unavenged death, as the more pressing concern. Furthermore, she declared that inati mercy should prevail, especially when divine command had played a role. She also essentially argued for the superiority of reasoned communal justice over the archaic system of endless blood feuds. It was a subtle yet profound shift. Justice was no longer merely a personal vendetta or a primal reflex, but a matter for the community, for the city-state to decide through a structured legal process. This moment established the Areopagus as a legitimate permanent court for homicide in Athens, setting a precedent for future legal proceedings. It symbolized a move from the old brutal ways of familial vengeance, where the curse of the Atreides found fertile ground to a new era of civic law and state-sponsored justice. It was Athens, through the wisdom of its patron goddess, stepping forward as the vanguard of a more civilized order. This is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating how foundational myths often provided divine legitimacy to real-world institutions and societal changes. Historians still argue about how much of this reflects the actual historical development of Athenian law versus being a retrospective justification within a dramatic work. However, the Furies were not about to take this lying down. They were absolutely incandescent with rage. Their ancient authority had been challenged, their sacred role diminished. They threatened to unleash plagues, barrenness, and general mayhem upon the city of Athens, plunging it into chaos. Their fury was palpable, a chilling reminder of the raw, untamed power of primal vengeance. You can almost hear them shrieking about ancient rights and this newfangled justice system. But Athena, ever wise and diplomatic, didn't just dismiss them. She engaged them not with force, but with persuasion. She offered them a new role, a new honor, a permanent place of reverence within Athens itself. She promised them a sacred cave beneath the Areopagus, eternal veneration from the Athenian people, and a new name, the Eumenides, the kindly ones, who would ensure the prosperity of the city, protecting it from internal strife and upholding justice. It was a brilliant move, transforming vengeful spirits into benevolent guardians. It's like turning your most persistent hecklers into your biggest fans. This transformation was critical. It signified the reconciliation of the old and new orders, the integration of ancient chthonic forces into the enlightened framework of civic law. The curse of the Atreides, driven by generations of unappeased vengeance, was finally being addressed not by another act of blood, but by reasoned compassion and the establishment of a formal justice system. The cycle, for the first time, had been truly challenged, not just prolonged. And for Orestes, it meant, at long last, an end to his torment. So, Athena, with a stroke of divine genius, has appeased the enraged Furies. She didn't just banish them, she transformed them, rebranding them from the terrifying Erinyes into the benevolent Eumenides, the kindly ones. They were granted a permanent revered sanctuary beneath the Areopagus forever, ensuring the prosperity and stability of Athens. This was a monumental shift, a symbolic triumph of enlightened justice over archaic blood vengeance. For Orestes, it meant the end of his relentless torment, the Furies' harrowing pursuit finally ceasing. He could at long last find peace. This transformation of the Furies into the Eumenides is arguably the single most important event in the entire cursed saga of the House of Atreus. It signifies the breaking of a cycle that had defined 4 generations of suffering, murder, and betrayal. From Tantalus's horrific feast, through Pelops' treachery, Atreus's unspeakable revenge, Agamemnon's tragic sacrifice and murder, and Orestes' agonizing matricide. The curse had operated on the principle of blood for blood. Every act of violence justified or not begat another, escalating the grief and suffering. But with the Furies' appeasement and transformation, that relentless, self-perpetuating cycle was finally interrupted. The curse of the Atreides, which had woven itself into the very fabric of this family's destiny, began to dissipate. It wasn't a sudden, magical eradication of all past wrongs, but a profound shift in how justice was administered and how ancient grievances were resolved. No longer would the Furies pursue every kin murder with unrelenting vengeance. Instead, their transformed selves, the Eumenides, would act as guardians of civic justice, ensuring that crimes were addressed through legal means rather than endless personal vendettas. It's like switching from a chaotic street brawl to a well-regulated court of law, still dealing with conflict, but in a much more orderly and less bloody fashion. This marks a crucial transition in the mythological understanding of justice in ancient Greece. It moves from a primitive system of blood feuds and divine retribution, where familial ties and ancient curses held absolute sway, to a more sophisticated system of state-administered law. The Areopagus, legitimized by Athena's judgment, becomes the symbol of this new order, representing reason, civic responsibility, and the triumph of the community's welfare over individual, unbridled vengeance. A mainstream historical fact. The Areopagus Council was a very real and ancient institution in Athens, evolving over time from a powerful aristocratic body to a more specialized court for homicide, embodying a shift in legal practices. Orestes, now acquitted and finally free from the Furies' torment, could begin to rebuild his life. He returned to Mycenae, or in some versions went to Argos, and successfully re-established his rule, bringing stability back to the troubled kingdom. His reign is often depicted as relatively peaceful and just a stark contrast to the tumultuous, blood-soaked reigns of his predecessors. He eventually married Hermione, the daughter of Menelaus, and Helen. Yes, that Helen. Remember her further integrating his line into the broader Greek heroic narratives, and perhaps symbolizing a healing of old wounds between the families that had been so central to the Trojan War. However, the memory of the curse, the weight of his actions, never truly left Orestes. He carried the scars of his experiences, a permanent reminder of the profound cost of his family's legacy. This nuanced ending reflects a quirky or fringe tidbit in Greek tragedy. Even when justice is served and curses are lifted, the psychological and emotional toll on the individuals involved is immense and often lasting. There's no magical reset button for centuries of trauma. Historians still argue about the precise social and political implications of the Oresteia and the narrative of Orestes' trial. Was it a direct commentary on contemporary Athenian legal reforms? Was it an endorsement of specific political factions? Or was it simply a profound meditation on the evolution of morality and justice? Regardless, the narrative powerfully illustrates the profound belief that societal order and individual well-being were inextricably linked to the proper administration of justice, moving beyond the ancient relentless cycle of vengeance. The house of Atreus, after generations of grief, had finally found a path, however difficult, towards redemption. And so, with Orestes acquitted, and the Furies transformed into the benevolent Eumenides, a profound quiet settles over the tumultuous house of Atreus. The incessant, agonizing clamor of ancestral curses of blood, demanding blood, finally begins to fade. It's not an abrupt silence, mind you, but more like the gradual dimming of a storm's thunder, leaving only the distant echo of past rumbles. The cycle, for the first time in generations, has been demonstrably broken, not by yet another act of violence, but by a novel intervention, justice, reasoned, debate, and divine compassion. Orestes, having endured the peak of the curse's intensity, lives out his reign, a king who knows the true cost of power and the bitter taste of inherited fate. His story becomes a testament to the possibility of moving beyond the ancient, relentless cycle of vengeance. He establishes a more stable and just rule in Mycenae or Argos, depending on the version you prefer. His personal journey from maddened fugitive to legitimate ruler mirrors the broader societal shift depicted in the myth from an era dominated by primal retribution to one governed by established law. You can almost imagine him looking out over his kingdom, a quiet wisdom in his eyes, forever marked by what he endured, but no longer defined by it. The influence of the Eumenides in Athens, and by extension across the Greek world, spreads. They are honored, their ancient power channeled into upholding civic order and ensuring the prosperity of the city. The fear of blood guilt doesn't vanish entirely, but its enforcement mechanism changes. Instead of being chased by terrifying snake-haired spirits, transgressors would now face the structured judgment of the community, mediated by divine wisdom. It's a sophisticated upgrade, like moving from a direct debit system to an entirely new digital banking platform. The money still moves, but the process is far more streamlined and accountable. This resolution provides a profound sense of closure to a narrative steeped in relentless tragedy. The foundational myths, like that of Tantalus, often serve not just as origin stories, but as cautionary tales, exploring the consequences of hubris, the nature of fate, and the terrifying power of transgression. This cycle, however, offers more than just a warning. It presents a path towards reconciliation and healing. It argues that even the most deeply ingrained patterns of violence can be transcended through wisdom, divine intervention, and the establishment of a just legal system. Historians still argue about whether the Oresteia was a pragmatic endorsement of specific legal reforms in Athens, or a broader philosophical statement about the human condition and the triumph of reason. Regardless, its enduring power lies in its portrayal of hope amidst despair. The legacy of the Atreides, from this point forward, is no longer solely one of escalating horror. It becomes a story of endurance, of profound suffering, that eventually leads to a transformative understanding of justice. The echoes of Tantalus's hubris, Pelops's deceit, Atreus's unspeakable cruelty, and Clytemnestra's vengeful wrath may still whisper through the ancient ruins, but they are no longer an inescapable command. The cycle is broken. The blood curse has at last found its end. So, as we bring our journey through the cursed generations of the House of Atreus to a close, consider the weight of those ancient narratives. They remind us that even the darkest family histories can eventually find a path to resolution, sometimes through immense struggle, sometimes through an unexpected intervention of wisdom. The long night of their grief has finally given way to the dawn of a new, if still fragile, order. The quiet wisdom of the Eumenides, once the embodiment of relentless vengeance, now presides over a hopeful future, a testament to the enduring human capacity to evolve, to learn, and to build something better from the wreckage of the past. Now, as the story settles, let your own mind begin to drift. The ancient myths, with all their intensity and drama, are fading into the gentle hum of the night. Let the images soften the harsh edges of vengeance and sorrow, blurring into a calming haze. Feel the quiet peace of the story reaching its end, the tension dissolving, leaving only the tranquil echoes of a narrative well told. The weight of those old curses lifts like mist dissipating with the morning light. You're safe here in the quiet, and the world of gods and heroes is drifting further and further away, leaving you to the gentle pull of sleep.